Hey guys, time to step into the boots of a 17th century plague doctor. Mask? Check. Mysterious herbs? Check. Okay, let's get straight into the eerie, the bizarre, and the very questionable life of a Black Death plague doctor. And if you enjoy, please leave a like and subscribe. Let's begin. The Plague Doctor's Dilemma. Venice, 17th century, the height of the plague. The day began with the usual fog, a thick, wet mist that clung to the streets, blurring the line between the living and the dead. The city had become a maze of silence, punctuated only by the rattling of carts, the occasional muffled cough and the calls of guards patrolling the cordoned-off areas. It was as if Venice itself were holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable. I made my way to the first home of the day, a once proud merchant's house that now stood like a mausoleum, its windows shuttered, its door marked with a dark stain. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of decay, a putrid blend of sweat, fever, and death. The family was already sick. Bodies sprawled across the floor, writhing in agony or lying still, their skin the unnatural pallor of plague victims. Paused in the doorway, surveying the scene. There was no one left to help them except me. I had seen this too many times, too many families torn apart in the span of a few days. But today, it was worse. The house was full, more than I had seen in many months of work. There were at least 10 people lying in various states of suffering, all of them begging for help, for a cure, for a miracle that I could not provide. I stepped forward, my boots heavy against the floorboards, echoing in the stillness. The family's cries cut through the air, but they didn't seem to reach me. I had learned long ago to silence that part of me, the part that wanted to weep with them, to promise them everything I could not deliver. I was no savior. I was just a man with a mask and a scalpel, carrying with me the burden of everyone's dying hope. My assistant, a young man who had been with me for months now, followed close behind. His face was pale, his eyes sunken from lack of sleep. "We had not stopped for rest in days, Doctor," he said, his voice trembling. "There's no room for all of them, we can't treat them all." I knew what he meant. I had already counted the faces in the room. A few of them were already dead, pale, lifeless, the signs unmistakable. The others were still alive but slipping fast, and there were more, dozens of others waiting for help outside. It was impossible. There was no way to save everyone, not with the few herbs we had, not with the tinctures and untested remedies. That had been offered to us. I took a deep breath, my gloved hands slick with sweat as I moved from one body to the next. My first stop was a woman, her skin mottled with the dark purple blotches that signaled the beginning of the end. I checked her pulse, though I already knew the answer. Weak. Fading. There was a child beside her, no more than 8, crying and clutching her mother's lifeless hand. I knelt down beside the child, feeling the desperate weight of their gaze on me. "Doctor," she whispered, "can you help my mother?" I didn't know how to answer her. My heart twisted, but I said nothing. I couldn't lie to her. Behind me, the assistant was tending to another patient, a man whose breathing was labored, whose body had begun to bloat with the disease. His sweat was soaked into the sheets, and his groans filled the air with the deep, terrible sound of suffering. We had no medicine strong enough to fight this plague. The herbs we carried were a poor substitute for what was needed. The belief in our ability to cure the disease was quickly fading with every death, every failed attempt. We were reduced to doing what we could, isolating the sick from the well, disinfecting the spaces where the infected lay, and hoping against hope that we could prevent further spread. I stood up, feeling the weight of the decision pressing down on me. There were too many people, too many cries for help. I couldn't stay here forever, and I had to move on. There was another house to visit, more suffering to witness, more lives to try to save. But even as I thought that, my feet felt as if they were glued to the floor. I looked over the room again, the dying mother, the child clinging to her, the man choking on his own breath. In the corner of the room, another man, a merchant judging by his fine clothes, sat slumped against the wall, his hands trembling as he clutched his chest. His breathing was shallow, desperate. His lips were blue and his skin was cold to the touch, a clear sign of the disease that had already begun to choke the life out of him. Who should I treat? Who should I leave behind? I could feel the weight of my decisions crushing me. There was no right answer. Every life lost would be a failure, a weight I would carry with me forever. And yet, the worst part was not the decision itself. It was the fear in the eyes of those who knew they wouldn't survive, the fear they could not hide no matter how hard they tried. I looked at the assistant, his face a mask of hopelessness. He was trying to save the merchant, but I knew that he too would soon succumb. There was no escaping the plague's reach. There was no place to run. I stepped back from the room, unable to make a decision. I knew what needed to be done, but there was no strength left in me to do it. We moved on. The Shadow of Pestilence. Autumn 1656. Outskirts of Venice, the most serene republic. The countryside was beginning to rot, not from the season, though the leaves were yellowing and the wind held the scent of distant frost. No, this was something deeper, more fetid, something that clung to the very bones of the earth. It had begun in the city, as it always did. First it was whispers from the port. A sailor died, then another, then the barkeep who served them. Before long the bells tolled not for the hour but for the dead, again and again until time itself seemed to vanish beneath their iron lament. Rode alone through the narrow, winding lanes that led from the stone walls of Venice into the nearby settlements. Small clusters of thatched roofs and leaning timber homes, all stooped as though the plague itself had bent them low. My horse, a black mare named Giostra, trotted without complaint, though her breath misted heavy in the chill and her ears twitched at the faintest sound. Even beasts had learned to fear the silence now. It was the year of our Lord 1656, and the Black Death had returned, again. This was not the first time I had donned the mask. I had walked the deadened streets of Naples in 1652, watched the soul of that city gutter out like a candle left too long to burn. I had buried more than I had saved. I knew the scent of plague. It lingered in the back of the throat like spoiled wine, like decay in a cellar sealed too long. It was the odor of death before death had arrived. My garb was heavy, sweltering but necessary. Layers of waxed fabric beneath a black overcoat, a wide-brimmed hat, gloves, boots, and the mask. Oh, the mask. A leather beak protruding from my face stuffed with herbs, lavender, mint, rose petals, camphor, all futile. The miasma didn't care for rosemary or superstition, but it gave people hope, and in times like these, hope was medicine enough. Venice itself was in chaos. The Doge had fled to Murano, the Senate met only by candlelight, and the streets were no longer ruled by merchants or gondoliers, but by rats and the dying. Entire quarters were sealed with wooden boards, churches overflowed with bodies, and the canals ran thick with filth and prayers unanswered. I had been assigned by the Council of Ten to serve the outer hamlets, where the state's physicians would not go. "For you are expendable," one had told me plainly, his fingers clasped as he sat behind a silk-draped desk. "A necessary function." I had nodded. We all had roles to play. It was on the third day of my rounds when I came upon the house. I saw it from the path, a small cottage at the edge of a vineyard, its vines now brown and tangled, the grapes left to ferment where they hung. The house was old, timber and stone, with a sagging roof and a chimney that exhaled no smoke. But it was the door. That stopped me. A red X had been painted upon it, crude, bold, unmistakable. The mark of plague, no name, no plea for help. Just the X, drawn with what looked like dried blood or ochre, smeared by trembling hands. I dismounted, Giostra stamping nervously at the gravel. She did not like the smell. None of them did. I approached slowly, pulling my gloves tighter, the mask already suffocating with the weight of herbs. I knocked once, then again. No answer. The silence was not ordinary. It wasn't peaceful or still. It was the kind of silence that pressed against your ears, as if even sound feared to enter, the kind of silence that told you the house had already made its bargain with death. I reached for the latch. It gave way with a soft groan, the door swinging inward to reveal the darkened room beyond. A sliver of grey light cut across the wooden floor, illuminating motes of dust that hung like spirits in the air. The hearth was cold, the ashes scattered. The chairs, 3 of them, were overturned, one lying broken against the far wall. The air inside was thick, unmoving, not stale, no. That would imply life had once stirred it. This was heavier than that. It was as though the house itself had exhaled one last breath and now held it, forever suspended. I stepped over the threshold, careful not to brush the frame. Plague clung to surfaces, we believed, or floated in the air, or moved with the rats. No one truly knew. We only knew it killed. The front room had been a kitchen once. Plates still sat on the table, one half filled with what might have been broth, now congealed and swarming with flies. A wooden spoon rested in the bowl. It looked abandoned mid-meal. Someone had been hungry, then suddenly not. I moved further in. There were signs of struggle. Sheets torn from the bed, a bloodied rag in the corner, footprints tracked in ash. But no bodies, that was the strangest part. The family, whoever they had been, were gone. 3 beds lined the back room, 1 large, 2 smaller. The parents and 2 children, I guessed. I imagined them here huddled together in fevered sleep, sweat-soaked and muttering in delirium. I had seen it too many times. The black swellings, buboes, growing like tumors in the armpits, groin, behind the ears. The shivering, the vomiting, the blood that came up like wine from a split cask. But there were no stains on the sheets. No scent of sickness, though the herbs in my mask dulled everything. No notes, no signs of hasty departure. Just emptiness. I checked the hearth, cold. I checked the cupboard, 3 empty bowls, a loaf of bread turned to stone. Our doll, handmade from straw and linen, lying face down on the windowsill. The house was empty in a way that felt intentional, as if they hadn't just died, but vanished. Taken. I walked outside again, turning back to face the house. The X glared at me in the morning light, stark and red and silent. No one had come to bury them. No cart had passed down this road in days. Behind the house I found the vineyard's edge. There, in a shallow hollow beneath a sycamore, I saw the earth disturbed. 3 mounds, not 4. Rough-hewn, the dirt barely covered what lay beneath. A scrap of cloth poked through, embroidered with a child's name, Lena. I did not need to dig. 3 buried, 1 unaccounted for. A chill ran through me, colder than the mask's breath, colder than the air. I marked the door again, this time with a small symbol of my own, a circle above a line. It meant seen, meant touched by death. It was a signal to others, if any others still came this way, that this home had been visited by the plague doctor and found wanting. I mounted Giostra in silence. She turned quickly, eager to leave the place behind. But as we rode, I could not stop thinking of the 4th. Where had the child gone, and had they carried the pestilence with them? The wind blew low across the vines as we left, and the air behind. Ours seemed to close like a wound, but I knew better. The wound was open, and it was festering. The silence of innocence. Autumn 1656. A village beyond Mestre, near the Venetian marshes. By the time I reached the village of San Corvo, the fog had begun to descend again, curling low along the muddy roads and creeping into the hollows, between the timber homes. The marshlands nearby breathed it out with every gust of wind, carrying the scent of brackish water, wet wood, and something else. Something older. In plague time, the air always felt haunted, like the world had forgotten how to be clean. I had been walking for hours. The mare, Giostra, had been stabled at the last hospice, left in the care of a boy whose hands shook when I passed him the reins. He didn't ask questions. No one did anymore. The sight of my coat and mask turned the bold into whispers, and the curious into ghosts behind shutters. San Corvo was a town half dead already. I could feel it in the way the birds no longer sang, in the boarded-up chapels, in the empty stalls at the market square. Doors had been nailed shut with planks, windows stuffed with linen soaked in vinegar. In one alley, a rat lay belly up on a cobblestone, its ribs moving slightly, as if death itself was unsure whether to claim it yet. I moved in silence. My boots pressed damp impressions into the road, and my staff tapped softly ahead like a blind man's cane, feeling for the sickness, hidden in the cracks of the world. Then I heard it, a voice thin and high cutting through the quiet like a bell. "Sir?" it called. "Excuse me, sir, are you the Birdman?" I turned. She was standing in the middle of the lane, no older than 6, wrapped in a wool shawl far too big for her. Her hair was a nest of curls, damp from the mist, and her bare feet were black with mud. But she didn't flinch at the sight of me. She looked up at the mask, at the long beak, the glass lenses over my eyes, with something like hope. "Children saw monsters differently. You're the one that fixes sick people, aren't you?" she asked, stepping closer. "You wear the mask so the bad air doesn't make you die." I didn't answer. I rarely did with children. But I knelt, so that I was closer to her height. She didn't back away. "It's my mama," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "She won't wake up. I made her tea and everything, but she just lies there now." My heart, or what remained of it, tightened. "Where is she?" I asked, the mask muffling my voice. She took my gloved hand. "Come, I'll show you." We walked together, slowly, past the boarded-up butcher's shop, where the flies swarmed in thick black clouds, past a cart filled with lime-soaked rags, past a man watching from behind a cracked window, unmoving as a wax figure. Her house was near the edge of the village, a squat, one-room cottage with ivy overtaking the chimney and a wooden door that creaked with every breeze. There was no red X on the door, no markings, no warning, just a child's hope and the stillness that plagued homes where time had stopped. She pushed open the door. "She's in bed," she said cheerfully, like she was inviting me in for supper. "She got very sleepy after she coughed all night. I tucked her in with Papa's blanket." I stepped inside. The air was heavy with the smell, not just the usual staleness of poor air and close quarters, but the scent, the unmistakable rot that even the mask's herbs could not fully hide. It was faint still, but it was there, beneath the lavender, the rose, the mint, like spoiled meat wrapped in perfume. The mother lay on a straw mattress near the hearth. One arm was stretched toward the floor. Her skin had the ashen pallor of someone who had been dead more than a day. Her lips were slightly parted, as if she had died mid-sigh. Her eyes were mercifully closed. I crossed the room, slowly, reverently. My boots creaked on the floorboards. I knelt beside her and placed a gloved hand on her throat. No pulse. The child came up beside me, watching. "She's very cold," she said softly. "I tried to make the fire, but I don't know how." I glanced at the hearth. It hadn't been lit in days. The kindling was damp. No warmth lingered in the stone. "What's your name?" I asked. "Emilia," she said. "What's yours?" I hesitated. "I'm a doctor," I replied. She nodded solemnly, as if that answered everything. "Can you wake her?" she asked. "Please." She stared at me then. Not like a child, but like someone much older. Like someone who had seen too much and yet still clung to something impossible. I wanted to lie. I wanted to say that she was only sleeping, that she would rise soon and braid Emilia's hair and make her broth and sing to her by candlelight. But lies are another kind of plague. I looked at her, and gently I shook my head. Her small face twisted, not in anger, not even in understanding, just confusion. "But I made tea," she said, tears gathering like dew in her eyes. "I made it how she likes it." She turned and picked up a small clay cup from the table. Cold tea with a sliver of root and a withered leaf floating in the water. She offered it to me with trembling hands. She said, "Tea makes everything better." I took the cup. I held it in my gloved hands as if it was sacred, and in a way it was. "She was right," I said quietly. "Sometimes it does." She sat down beside her mother's body, curling into the blanket she had laid so lovingly across her. She didn't cry. Not yet. Children rarely did at first. Their minds made space for grief slowly, like shadows creeping into a room as the light dies. "Will she go to heaven?" she asked. "I think she's already there," I said. The wind stirred outside, rattling the shutters. Somewhere, far off, a bell tolled once. A single chime. A name lost to the records of the living. I rose, gently placing the cup on the table. "I'll return soon," I said. "With help. Will you stay here, Emilia?" She nodded, still holding her mother's hand. As I stepped outside, I reached into my satchel, and pulled forth a small vial of blessed water and chalk. I marked the door quietly. Not with the red X, no, this was different. A cross with a circle above it. Death has passed through, but a soul still remains. I walked back into the fog. The road was empty. The village watched from its shadows. But I carried something heavier with me now. Not a corpse, not a contagion, but the echo of a little girl's voice in a house where time had stopped, and the weight of knowing that in this world, not even the smallest hearts were spared. Ashes and Silver. Late autumn 1656, Padua within the Venetian Republic. The city had grown quieter in recent days, not with peace, but with absence. Streets, once filled with the clamour of carts and merchants, now echoed only the hollow footfalls of those who dared to walk them. Padua, learned, ancient, noble, had become a place where doors breathed shut and windows blinked once before closing for good. The bells no longer tolled for each death. There were too many. A single peal might represent dozens, sometimes hundreds. The air itself had changed. It no longer smelled of life. Even the canals, thick with stagnation, seemed to groan under the weight of what lingered beneath their surface. I moved along the Calle dei Fabbri in silence, the long shadow of my coat dragging behind me, the beaked mask catching glints of dying sunlight as it dipped behind the stone facades. Every door I passed had a story behind it. Most would never be told. Then I heard him, the shuffle of hurried footsteps, the sharp clink of metal on stone. A man, gaunt and frantic, stumbled toward me from a side alley. His boots were uneven, one missing a sole entirely, and his cloak hung off him like wet paper. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, and he trembled not from cold but from some deeper fever of the soul. "Please," he shouted, voice cracking with desperation. "Signore medico." I turned, and before I could speak, he threw something at my feet, coins. A handful of them, some silver, some copper, all tarnished. They scattered across the cobblestones, spinning in the dying light like broken promises. "Take them," he cried, falling to his knees. "Take it all. I have more. Hidden beneath the floorboards. My wife, my only child. They are gone. But I still live. Why do I still live? Tell me, cure me, or kill me. Either is mercy." He wept openly now, scraping at the hem of my coat, leaving smudges of dirt and something darker. Blood? I couldn't tell. His sobs were dry, exhausted, the kind that came from a man who had not slept in days. "I've done everything," he rasped. "Wore the vinegar rags, burned the sage, never left the house. I don't go near the sick, I swear. I even confessed my sins, every single one. But my bones ache, my skin burns. I can feel it creeping inside me. Please, I don't want to die screaming. I don't want to see their faces again when I sleep." I bent down slowly, staff, steady, and gently removed his hands from my cloak. "I cannot promise what no man can give," I said softly, my voice muffled by the mask. "But you are not alone." He blinked up at me, the fire in him sputtering, and then quietly he nodded. I placed a small sachet in his palm, herbs soaked in camphor and rose oil. Useless, perhaps, but the illusion of comfort could sometimes slow the true rot. That or mercy would come before the fever took him fully. As he knelt there, cradling the pouch like a saint's relic, I turned and continued down the lane. The coins were left behind. Silver had no use to the dying. I had another appointment. A letter had arrived earlier that morning, slipped beneath the hospice door, unsigned, with only an address, Via della Morte, number 9. I knew the street. It was one of the older quarters, tucked beneath crumbling archways, where the facade still bore the scars of past fires and floods. A place forgotten even before the plague. When I reached the door, it was already ajar. The hinges creaked as I entered. Inside, the air was thick, not just with scent but with something else. A heaviness, as though the house had exhaled for the last time and refused to breathe again. Candles lined the walls, dozens, hundreds maybe. Their wax had run down the tables, pooled across the floor, dripped into strange, skeletal patterns. The wicks were burnt black. Smoke still clung to the beams, coiling like dying spirits. No one came to greet me. There was a single room, sparse, A bed in the corner. An empty bowl beside it, half filled with dried herbs. A cracked mirror on the far wall. And the note, folded neatly, resting on the pillow where the patient should have been. I crossed to it slowly. Each step sent soft crackles through the wax. Beneath my boots. The bed had been recently slept in, sheets still warm beneath my gloved touch. I unfolded the letter. To the one who arrives too late. Do not look for me. The sickness was not in my lungs. It was in the silence, in the waiting, in the nights where no one spoke my name. I watched the candles die one by one. I could not watch the last. Let the wax be my marker. Let the fire I did not fear be my offering. Burn this place when you leave. No one should wait here again. I stood there, the words seeping into the room like smoke. There were no signs of struggle. No blood. No scent of rot. Only absence. I checked the cupboards. Empty. The hearth. Cold. The cellar was sealed. The patient had left, or perhaps had never been entirely there. I stepped out of the room and back into the fog. Outside, the street was quiet. No mourners, no neighbors, just shuttered windows and candle stubs in iron holders melted to nothing. I stood a moment longer, then struck a match. The fire took quickly. The old beams drank the flame like wine. By the time I walked away, the house was alight. It would burn through the night, and in the morning nothing would remain but ash and wax. As I turned the corner, I saw the man again, the desperate one. He was still kneeling, clutching the pouch, rocking gently. He looked up at the sky as if expecting an answer, but there was only smoke curling above the rooftops, and a silence no amount of coin could ever buy back. The Weight of Names. Winter, 1656, edge of the Venetian lagoon. The wind off the water bit through my cloak like a blade honed by the dead. It howled across the lagoon, carrying with it the scent of rot, brine, and something older, something that seemed to rise from the very silt of the shore, like the forgotten voices of the past had finally found breath. I stood alone, a silhouette in a city of shadows. Behind me, Venice slumped against the horizon like a grieving widow, her towers bowed, her windows shuttered in mourning. So even the bells had grown weary. They tolled not for the individual now, but for the day itself, as if warning time that it too might soon be swallowed. Before me, the lagoon stretched wide and grey beneath a sky that could no longer remember what colour was. The sun, when it appeared, did not warm, merely illuminated the ruin. Fog clung low to the water, hiding the thin boats that drifted back and forth across the current, each carrying its cargo with reverent silence. The barges did not carry the living. This was the new ritual. They came in twos and threes, ferrymen, dressed in rags soaked with pitch and fear, pushing their flat-bottomed vessels through the shallows with long poles. On each boat, the bodies lay in heaps, shrouded in linen where there was cloth to spare, or left bare when there was not. Some were still adorned with rosaries, hands frozen in prayer, mouths agape as though calling out to saints who had long since stopped listening. There were no priests here, no choirs, no Latin spoken over the open pits. Only the wind, the caw of gulls and the scrape of shovels against frozen earth. A trench had been dug near the edge of the lagoon, long, wide, and impossibly deep. At its base the first bodies already lay, stiff and tangled like driftwood. Some had been there since the night before. Frost had gathered on their lashes. Rats scurried between limbs, bold in their hunger. The men at the trench, gravediggers, and condemned alike, wore masks soaked in vinegar and stuffed with myrtle. They did not speak. Their movements were mechanical, their faces hidden beneath rough cloth and leather hoods. They moved as if their souls had already been buried, and only muscle remained. One of the barges creaked up to the shore, and the bearers began to unload. I watched them work, 2 men lifting, one guiding, another with a tally board in hand. But the board was blank. They had long stopped recording names. There were too many, and for most, there was no one left to speak their names, even if they had. Been known? Children were placed atop their mothers, old men beside soldiers, strangers layered upon one another like pages in a book no one would ever read. Each body hit the pit with a soft thud or a dull splash, depending on how deep the trench, had sunk into the marsh, no cries, no rites. Only the work. I stood at the edge for a long time, beaked mask facing the sea of the dead. They had once been citizens, sailors, bakers, lovers, thieves, teachers. Some had perhaps shared my table once, crossed themselves beside me in chapel, argued about politics in the piazza. Now they were only flesh and silence. A boy's arm slipped free from a linen shroud as it was lowered, thin and delicate. A ring, too large for his hand, hung from one finger. I wondered who had given it to him. A mother, a sister, someone already beneath the pit? I took out my journal. Not for names, I did not know them, but for record. I counted 83 bodies in that trench alone. By nightfall there would be more, I wrote. The lagoon receives them now. The ground is too wet for memory. They do not ask for prayers, only rest. The diggers pause to eat. Salted fish and black bread eaten. In silence, backs to the pit. One crossed himself before resuming. Another wept quietly as he worked, wiping his face on a sleeve stained with dirt and plague. A small wooden marker was driven into the ground at the trench's edge. It bore no writing, only a slash of red paint, a warning, or perhaps a benediction. In its own crude way, the wind picked up. I watched it ripple across the surface of the lagoon where more boats approached. Always more. Always too many. As I turned to leave, the sound of wings beat behind me. A line of crows had gathered along the trench's rim, black against grey, waiting. The living, it seemed, were not the only ones who had grown used to the rituals of death. Walked back toward the city. The streets would be quieter now. Fewer windows showed candlelight. More doors bore the red mark. I passed by a child's doll, half buried in the mud. Its porcelain face stared up at me, mouth parted, eyes cracked. Even it, I thought, had been left without a name. The Last Toast. Evening 1656, Venice near Campo San Polo. By evening the fog had thinned to a silver mist, casting a pallid sheen over the city like dust upon forgotten marble. Venice was a place of echoes now, sounds lingering longer than they should, footsteps resonating through empty streets, and laughter remembered in the silence between closed shutters. I moved through the fading light like a shadow in morning. The scent of decay followed me, a perfume no mask could truly block. Vinegar, lavender, and camphor clung to the fabric inside the beaked nose, but the stench of rot, the slow unraveling of bodies and lives, always found its way through. It was in the walls, in the wood, in the stone. It was in me. Tonight, I was bound for a home once envied, now hushed. The merchant Tommaso degli Orsi had once traded in silk and spice, dealing with noble houses in Florence and Milan. His banquets were known from the Doge's palace to the bridges of Rialto. I had never attended them, of course, but I had seen the flicker of candles through high windows, heard the music drifting over the canal like the sweet perfume of a world I would never know. Now that music was gone. The palazzo, once brilliant with colour, was dulled by grime. The gondolas no longer moored out front. The brass lion's head on the door hung crooked, its once roaring face now sagged with rust. I knocked with the butt of my cane. 3 slow taps, not a summons, a warning. The door opened. Tommaso greeted. Me himself. He was thinner now, skeletal, his fine robes sagging off his frame like damp velvet on a corpse. His eyes, sunken and red-rimmed, still carried the spark of a man not yet broken, but close. "Very close, Doctor," he said, bowing slightly. "I have something for you." He led me through the front hall, past portraits draped in black cloth. Dust lay in soft piles along the marble, and the tapestries on the wall hung limp and faded. The air was thick with myrrh and desperation. We came to a table in the salon. Upon it, laid like offerings at an altar, were the relics of a life once gilded, a brooch of pearls, a silver crucifix, tarnished but fine, a ring with the degli Orsi crest, gold with a blood-red stone, a child's lace bonnet, too small for any living memory. "These," he said, voice trembling, "are all I have left that death hasn't stolen. I'll give them for what you can spare. Anything. Marjoram, rosemary, rue. My wife coughs blood, and my boy, he sleeps all day feverish and pale." I did not ask how many others in the house had already gone. I gave him dried lemon balm, some willow bark, and powdered angelica root, useless against what gripped them, but kind to the nerves. I made a tincture of wormwood and wine and left it unlabeled. Sometimes hope was the only medicine that worked. He pressed the ring into my gloved hand. I would have given it for nothing, he whispered. But my pride, it needed to believe I still had something worth trading. I nodded. Words did little good anymore. As I turned to leave, a voice called from the back chamber. Dottore. It was a woman's voice, soft, but clear. I paused, then turned toward it. She was seated near a window, the shutters ajar just enough to let in the dying light. Her dress was of fine fabric, but it hung like a shroud on her narrow frame. Her skin had the color of porcelain gone to dust, and her lips were tinged with blue. A fever lived behind her eyes, but there was no fear in them, only calm. A glass of wine sat on the table beside her. Another, untouched, stood beside it. "Come," she said. "Sit. Drink with me. You won't take the mask off, I know, but just toast. Just once." I did not sit, but I stepped closer. "Is it safe?" I asked, the voice from beneath the mask rasping like wind over stone. "Nothing is," she replied, smiling. "But I won't see the sun rise. Let me raise a glass. Before the night takes me." She poured the wine, a red the color of old blood. She held her glass toward me. I hesitated. Then slowly I reached out, gloved fingers curling around the stem of the untouched chalice. I did not drink. I could not. But I lifted it all the same. "To what shall we toast?" I asked. She looked toward the open shutters. The fading light caught her hair, and for a moment she seemed untouched by the plague. "To what we loved," she said, "and to what we lost." We clinked the glasses together. The sound was soft, final. She sipped. Her eyes closed. For a moment peace washed over her features, an actress bowing at the end of a long tragic play. I set my glass down beside hers, still full. I said nothing more. I turned and left her there, in that quiet, golden light, with her wine and her memories. By morning the shutters would be closed, the room silent, the glass still half full, and the house would become another story, whispered behind curtains, told by those who were still waiting for the knock at their own door. Instruments of Mercy. Nightfall 1656, Venice. The plague doctor's quarters. The canals were black now, the water still and reflecting nothing, like a mirror that had forgotten how to remember. The stars above the city were veiled behind a haze of chimney smoke and the perpetual fog that drifted in from the lagoon. Even the moon had chosen not to rise. Venice had become a city of silhouettes and ash. I crossed the narrow bridge behind my lodgings, the worn planks creaking beneath my boots. To the world, I was only another shadow in a city of the dying. But inside, beneath the mask, beneath the hood, behind the glass that shielded my eyes, I could feel the fatigue sink into me like water through rotted wood. Tonight I would not see another patient. Tonight I would return to my rooms, to cleanse, to prepare, to put order to the chaos, to ready myself for another day of walking. In death's wake. The building I lived in had once been a minor abbey, long since abandoned by the brothers who fled with the first wave of the sickness. It had thick stone walls and narrow halls that held the cold like a second soul. It was perfect. No one came here. Not anymore. I closed the door behind me, bolting it shut. The lock clicked with a finality that always brought some small comfort, though I knew it was illusion. The plague respected no door, no wall, no vow or virtue. I removed the beaked mask first, setting it gently on its perch beside the hearth. The leather creaked as I unstrapped the hood, the long robe, the waxed canvas, gloves. One by one I peeled away the layers like the skin of an old snake, until I stood in my linen undershirt, sweat-soaked and trembling slightly from the cold. The ritual began. I lit a single candle, then another, then a third. I placed them in a triangle around the small wooden table in the center of the room. Their flames flickered with the draught, their light spilling amber across the floor. There on the table, I laid out a sheet of clean linen as white as I could manage in this age of filth and soot. The tools came next. From the leather satchel I carried daily, I withdrew each implement with the care of a priest tending relics. Of the Passion, the scalpel, small, curved, deadly in both precision and implication. It was meant for lancing buboes, though I rarely used it. By the time they called for me, it was often too late for such hope. The needle and thread, rough suited for sewing what wounds I could close, mostly injuries from violent thrashing or panicked restraint. I unwound the thread slowly, watching. It glint in the candlelight like spun silver. The jar of leeches, 3 left. I had not used them in days. Even superstition had its limits now. The glass vials, 8 in total. Only 2 still held their contents. Tinctures made of wormwood, garlic, sage, and smoke. I cleaned them, polishing the glass with a square of cloth, as though they were sacred vessels, the bone-handled knife, not for medicine, but for defense. Rust crept along the edge. I sharpened it slowly, the sound of stone on metal whispering through the silent room, and then the book, my ledger. Bound in cracked leather and swollen from moisture, it contained the names of every patient I had seen and every outcome. I opened it with reverence. The ink was beginning to fade on the earlier pages, but the names were there. Giovanni C., carpenter, 34, deceased. Madonna Elisabetta, widow, 62, deceased. Benedetta, infant, 7 months, deceased. I wrote 2. Mortonite, Tommaso degli Orsi, pending, unnamed woman, wife of Tommaso, presumed deceased. No page in the book ended in survival. Not in weeks. The silence of the room deepened. Outside, the bells began to toll, low and steady. Another death, another home marked by X. Another soul ferried into the unknown. I stood for a moment, staring down at my tools. They were clean now, sterilized in spirits, wrapped in cloth, lined in order. Each one had its place: scalpel, needle, tincture, vial, ledger. It was not unlike preparing a chapel for Mass. In some ways I was more priest than doctor now, a witness to last breaths, a deliverer of final comforts. My communion was herbs, my sermons were silence, and the bodies, my congregation, grew by the day. I turned from the table, kneeling before the hearth. A bowl of water rested near the embers. I dipped my hands into it. It was cold as a grave. I scrubbed until my skin burned, beneath the nails, around each knuckle, between the fingers, until the water ran brown and red and grey. And still I felt unclean. There was no water, no fire, no tincture that could scour the weight from me. I rose, wrapping myself in a woolen shawl. The tools lay behind me now, glowing faintly in the candlelight like relics on a sacred altar. Tomorrow I would need them again. I extinguished 2 of the candles, left one burning. Its light cast my shadow long across the floor, the silhouette of the mask looming beside me, a bird of death, its beak ever pointed toward the next soul. I sat beside the window and listened to the water lapping against the stones, to the creak of gondolas unmanned, to the breathing silence of a city still, crumbling. I would sleep for a time, an hour, maybe 2, enough to forget the taste of copper in the air, enough to dream of days before the plague came, enough to believe even briefly that I was more than just a mourner in disguise. Then, at first light, I would return to the streets. The tools would be ready. The mask would be waiting. And so would the dying. The Rooftops and the Fallen. Midnight 1656. Venice near the Campo dei Mori. The sky was a vault of black glass, unbroken by moon or star. The city below breathed like a dying beast, each wheezing exhale rustling through shuttered alleys and across stagnant canals. From the rooftop where I stood, the world stretched out in dim pools of firelight, torch flames swaying in sconces, their reflections dancing across water like restless spirits seeking the living. Up here, Venice no longer looked like a city. It resembled a vast necropolis, its towers and domes like grave markers, rising above a flooded tomb. The climb had been steep, rickety iron rungs set into the side of an old merchant's house, long since abandoned. I had scaled it in silence, drawn upward by the need for air, for distance, for something beyond the stench of vinegar and rot and grief. The wind pressed against my cloak, tugging it gently toward the east, where the lagoon shimmered faintly, under the haze. Far in the distance I could see the outline of San Michele, the island of the dead. That's where many of them were going now, when space allowed, when the barges could still be rowed, and always, beneath everything, the bells. Not ringing anymore. Listening. I stood motionless, my plague mask held in one hand, my breath clouding in the cold night. Below, a gondola slid silently beneath a narrow bridge, bearing a single cloaked passenger and a body wrapped in linen. There was no singing now, no gondolier's lullaby, only the dip of oars and the muffled cry of the wake against stone. A dog barked somewhere in the maze below me, then silence again. And then a whisper of metal on cobblestone. I turned, peering across the jagged rooftops, eyes searching for movement. A shadow slipped between buildings, just beyond the lantern glow. It moved unnaturally, stumbling, then falling. I descended, quickly, boots thudding on the roof tiles, one careful step after another until I reached the edge. From there I dropped onto a balcony, and then down again, landing in a narrow calle half-choked by garbage and the smell of burnt tallow. The torchlight barely reached this far, so I lit the small oil lamp I kept hidden in my satchel. Its flame hissed to life, casting a weak halo across the stones, and there, half submerged in the gutter, a body. At first I thought it was another patient. Then I saw the robes, the gloves, the shape of the mask, a plague doctor. I knelt beside him. He was sprawled awkwardly, one arm twisted beneath his back, the other stretched toward the wall, as if he had been trying to drag himself forward. The beaked mask had cracked where it struck the stones, and through the split I could see a sliver of his mouth, jaw slack, lips parted, teeth clenched with the final effort. I reached out, brushing back the hood to see more clearly. He was young, no more than 30. His face, pale even in life, had taken on that waxen grey sheen I had come to know far too well. His eyes were glassy, wide open, still staring at something only he could see. There was no blood, no sign of violence, but I saw the lesions on his neck, the way his fingers were clenched so tight that the nails had broken skin. He had known. He had known what was happening to him, and still he had kept walking. Still he had tried to return. I found his satchel nearby, flung beneath a barrel. The leather was soaked, but inside everything was there. Vials of tincture, a single bone saw, a blood-stained rag, a small wooden carving of the Madonna. And his ledger. I opened it. The last entry was written in a shaky hand. House on the Rio del Mondo Novo. Mother fevered. Daughter showing signs, no priest available, no mention of his own symptoms, no plea, no farewell. He had gone about his duty, alone, and now he was another name no one would record, another helper taken by the very mercy he tried to deliver. Sat beside him for a long time, the lamplight flickered in my hand. A rat scurried nearby, sniffing the folds of his cloak. I shooed it away with the back of my glove. Overhead, a bell finally sounded. Not a church bell, not tonight. The bell of the death cart. A slow iron chime that rang once for every soul to be collected. The sound rolled over the rooftops and through the narrow streets, a deep-throated groan that reverberated in my bones. I reached down, straightened the doctor's mask, smoothed his robes, pulled his hood up to hide the paleness of his face. He had been one of us. That deserved something, at least. A small rite, a final gesture of dignity. I whispered a prayer. Not one from Scripture, not any more. Just words from the old tongue, the one my mother used when I was a child, long before the plague had turned me into this shadow of a man. Then I rose. I could not carry him, not far, but I would mark the street. When the cart came, they would... No, I took a piece of chalk from my satchel and drew the cross of death on the wall above him, large, visible even in torchlight, a symbol to the collectors that this one had fallen not as a victim, but as a servant. a symbol that he should not be tossed like trash into the pit. And then I walked on, back through the alley, through the passageways that groaned with the weight of silence. I climbed again to the rooftops, heart hammering, back to the place where I could see the water, the torchlight, the fragile outline of the city still clinging to its memory of grandeur. The doctor's satchel was slung over my shoulder. Now I would clean it, sterilize the tools, restore what I could. It was the least I could do, because tomorrow I would walk his route, and I would pray that when I fell, it would not be alone, on a gutter stone under a moonless sky. But even if I did, let it be. The plea for a cure. Florence, 17th century, the height of the plague. The day had already begun to wear on, the sun filtering through the fog like a smudge of light on a dirty canvas. I walked through the alleyways, my mask heavy on my face, my footsteps echoing against the stone walls. The plague was everywhere now, each neighborhood, each street, a new horror to confront. The cries of the dying seemed to mingle with the cries of the desperate, the ones who clung to any hope they could find. Today, I was called to the home of a family who had been marked for quarantine. A small, unassuming house at the edge of the district. The door was shut tight, the window panes thick with grime. The air around it reeked of decay, the sourness of death clinging to the walls. I raised my hand to knock, hesitating for only a moment before pushing the door open. It creaked on its hinges, revealing the interior, a scene of suffocating misery. The room was dim, the only light coming from a single guttering candle in the corner. Shadows played on the walls, stretching like long fingers. The father, once a man of strength and pride, now lay on a mattress in the corner, his body ravaged by the fever. His eyes were glassy, unfocused, his breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. The bed was soaked in sweat, his body barely able to move, and yet the family still clung to a semblance of hope. His wife stood at his side, her face gaunt and hollow, her eyes red from crying. The children huddled together in the corner, their faces pale, their lips silent. The woman turned as I entered, her hands trembling. "Doctor," she said, her voice breaking, "please, you must save him. You have to. He's all we have left. We cannot lose him." The desperation in her voice made my stomach twist, but there was nothing I could say, there was nothing I could do. The plague had its grip on him, and it would not let go. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice muffled by the mask. "There is no cure. The fever has taken hold. He has little time left." She collapsed to her knees, her sobs racking her body. No, you don't understand. You must. There's a potion, something that can save him," they said. I felt the weight of her words hang in the air. It was a plea I'd heard too many times, people clinging to false hope, hoping that some unproven remedy, some whispered secret cure might save them. But there was nothing. No potion, no miracle. "The plague has no cure," I said softly, my voice filled with an exhaustion that had nothing to do with the day's work. It was a weariness that had settled deep within me, as much a part of my bones as the mask I wore. "What I can do is make him comfortable in his final moments." Her sobs grew louder, and the children huddled together, their faces etched with confusion and fear. They didn't understand why their father, who had once been the pillar of their world, was now nothing more than a shadow of his former self. I moved to the father's side, my gloved hands careful as I checked his pulse. It was weak, fluttering like the last breath of a candle's flame. His skin was cold and clammy, his body stiff with the early signs of rigor mortis. I turned to the woman, who was now clutching my sleeve, her nails digging into the fabric. "Doctor, please," she begged, "is there truly nothing you can do? You must have something to save him." I looked at her, my heart heavy with a sorrow I could not express. It was a familiar pain, seeing the desperation in their eyes, knowing that nothing could save them. The weight of their hope pressed down on me like a stone, but I could not carry it. "Give him water," I said, pulling away from the bedside. "Keep him cool and I will return later, but I fear there is nothing more I can offer." She nodded, tears streaming down her face as she turned to her husband, the man who had once been the provider, the protector. Now, he was just another victim of the plague, another soul lost to a disease that had no mercy. I turned to leave the room, my heart aching for them, but there was nothing I could do. There were more homes to visit, more lives to try and save, or at least ease the suffering of. As I stepped out into the street, the heavy weight of the mask pressing down on my face, I caught a glimpse of the other houses in the neighborhood. Some windows were open, others closed. The quiet was suffocating, broken only by the distant sound of the bells calling the dead to their graves. In the distance, I could see another family, just as desperate, just as lost. The world had become a cycle of sickness, of death, of hopelessness. But there was no time for pity. There was no time for anything but the work. The plague had claimed another victim today, and soon it would claim them all. The exorcism of the plague, Bologna, 17th century, the height of the plague. The air was thick with tension as I made my way through the square. A crowd had gathered, more of them than I'd seen in a while, surrounding a small figure in the center. The sound of their voices, rising in pitch, filled the air like a storm-gathering force. They were shouting, pointing, and some were crying. I couldn't see the child at first, but the way the people moved, the way they looked over their shoulders, I knew something was wrong. They were terrified. A man stepped toward me as I approached, his face wild with desperation. "Doctor, you must help. You must perform the exorcism." His hands trembled as he spoke, and his breath came in ragged bursts. "The child has been cursed. The sickness, it's not the plague, no, it's the devil's work." I stood still for a moment, the weight of my mask pressing down on me. I had seen many things, but this madness was not something I was prepared for. The plague had brought people to their knees, but it had also brought forth a frenzy of superstition and fear. The man pulled me toward the center of the crowd. There on the ground lay a small child, no more than 5 or 6 years old. The child was pale, drenched in sweat, their eyes dull and unseeing. A high fever had taken hold of them, their body trembling as if they were caught in some fevered dream. The townspeople stood in a tight circle, muttering prayers in hushed tones. Some clutched crosses or holy relics, while others held up jars of herbs or charms, as if expecting them to ward off some evil spirit. "Please, doctor," a woman sobbed, stepping forward with a rosary in her hands. "You must drive out the demon. You must save her soul. Her soul is lost to the devil, and the plague is just a sign of it. Please, we beg you." I felt a surge of frustration rise in my chest. The plague had already taken so much, so many lives, so much hope, and now it seemed it was robbing people of their sanity as well. The belief in curses, in demons, was not new, but it was growing, fed by the fevered panic and dread of the times. I moved slowly to the child's side, kneeling, down to examine her. Her skin was cold, her breath shallow, and the rattling sound of her lungs was unmistakable. This was no curse. This was the plague, its signature unmistakable. There was no spirit or demon at work here, just death. I reached into my bag and pulled out a vial of medicine, nothing more than a temporary relief for the suffering, but it was something. "This child is gravely ill," I said, my voice muffled by the mask. "What she suffers from is the plague. There is no demon. There is no curse. There is only sickness, and it will take her unless we act swiftly." The crowd gasped, and a murmur of disbelief rippled through them. The man who had approached me earlier was now shaking his head, his eyes wide with fear. "No, doctor, you are wrong. The plague does not take children. This is something else, something darker." Another voice joined in, a woman from the back of the crowd. "Yes, the devil has come to our town. We've seen it. Cursed children before signs of it. The devil is among us." Her voice rose in a shrill panic. The fear in the crowd was palpable, a suffocating cloud that made it hard to think clearly, but I could not afford to lose myself in it. I could not allow them to make this worse. "The plague does not care for age or innocence," I said, my voice firm, but I could see the doubt creeping into their eyes. They didn't believe me. "You must trust me. The child's fever is high. I need water, cloths, and a bed. If we move quickly, she may survive, but we cannot waste time. Every moment counts." But they didn't listen. Their fear was too loud, too overwhelming. A man near the front stepped forward, shaking his fists. "You are not a priest, doctor. You have no power to save her. We need the exorcism. It is the only way." Suddenly the crowd surged forward, as if trying to push me out of the way to take matters into their own hands. Someone in the back shouted, "The demon will leave her body with the holy rites. The demon will flee." I backed away, my heart pounding in my chest, my mind reeling. The confusion, the hysteria, it was everywhere. It wasn't just the disease killing these people. It was their panic, their refusal to understand the reality of what they were facing. I grabbed the child in my arms, holding her tightly, trying to shield her from the frenzy around us. "This will not help her," I pleaded. "Please do not listen to their madness. This is a child of God, not a vessel for the devil. We must save her." But my words fell on deaf ears. The hysteria had already taken root. As I turned to leave with the child in my arms, the crowd parted reluctantly, whispering among themselves. They still did not understand. But the sick child was in my arms, her fever growing worse, and I knew that there was little time left. By the time I reached the nearest house and laid her in a bed, the fever had nearly consumed her. The people would not listen to reason. They had wanted an exorcism, something that could not cure the child. They were caught in their fear, and I was just another figure in their nightmare, another part of the plague they could not fathom. She died that night, her body still in my arms when I last checked her pulse, and with her death another piece of the city's fragile sanity crumbled away. The weight of superstition, Lombardy, 1630s. The road to the village was long and uneven, the path winding through a thick expanse of woods that seemed to close in with each step. The trees stood like silent sentinels, their branches gnarled and twisted, casting long, haunting shadows in the early morning light. A chill hung in the air, the kind that makes the skin prickle and the bones ache. The village was small, tucked away from the world, isolated by both geography and fear. Rumors had begun to spread about it, whispers of a curse laid upon the land, of wrongs that had been done and must now be atoned for. The plague had come to this place, like it had to so many others, but here it was more than just disease. It was retribution, or so the villagers believed. As I arrived, the first thing I noticed was the silence. There were no voices, no sounds of children playing in the street, no distant chatter from the markets, just the wind rustling the leaves and the occasional creak of an old wooden door. I made my way to the center of the village, where a small group of villagers had gathered. Their eyes were wide, frantic with fear, and they stepped aside to make room for me, their expressions a mix of hope and desperation. "Doctor, you've come," an elderly woman said, her voice tremulous with age and dread. "But we fear it's too late." I nodded, stepping forward. My cloak brushed against the cobblestones, and the familiar scent of herbs and incense filled the air. The villagers had lined the streets with makeshift candles, their flickering light casting a dim, eerie glow over the scene. "You must perform the ritual, Doctor," another man urged, his eyes wide with superstition. "We've seen the signs. The plague is a curse. The wrong must be set right before you treat the sick." I had heard this before, these delusions, these fears. They were an unfortunate consequence of ignorance. The plague had come, and the villagers needed something to blame, something to explain the suffering. It was easier to believe in curses than in the terrifying truth, that disease did not discriminate, that it ravaged all, rich and poor alike, regardless of their sins. I glanced around at their faces, all desperate and trembling, hoping for a miracle. They believed in this ritual, this ancient custom passed down through generations, and if I was to have any hope of treating them, I knew I would have to play along. "Tell me of the ritual," I said, my voice muffled by the mask. The villagers looked at each other before one of the men stepped forward, holding a small wooden bowl filled with dried herbs. "It must be burned," he said, his hands shaking as he extended it to me. "The smoke will purify the air and the land. It will lift the curse." I didn't have the heart to argue. They were far beyond reason, and if I was to do anything to help, I had to work within the framework of their beliefs. So, I took the bowl, and with an air of solemnity, I held it over a flame. The herbs smoldered, releasing a faint, acrid smell that made my stomach twist. The villagers chanted quietly, their voices a murmur in the still air, and for a moment, I allowed myself to believe that this strange ritual could somehow offer them a semblance of comfort. But deep inside I knew better. There was no magic here, there was no curse to lift, only the disease creeping through their veins, waiting to take its toll. As the smoke swirled around us, I turned my attention to the first of the sick. An old man, pale and shaking, lay in a makeshift bed in the small house beside the square. His breathing was shallow, his skin a deathly pallor. The smell of sweat and decay filled the room, mingling with the stench of burned herbs. I approached, him carefully checking for the usual signs: fever, chills, swollen lymph nodes. His body was riddled with them, his pulse weak and erratic. This was not the first time I had seen this. These were the unmistakable symptoms of the plague, and nothing could stop its spread. "You see," I said softly to the old man, though I doubted he could hear me through the fog of his delirium. "The disease does not come because of curses. It spreads through contact, through the air. There is no supernatural force at work here, only death, as it always has been." The old man's eyes fluttered open for a moment, but he didn't respond. His gaze was distant, vacant. I closed my eyes for a moment, the weight of the situation pressing on my chest. I could not save him. No one could. I turned back to the villagers, who were still watching me with their hopeful, pleading eyes. They were waiting for me to say something, anything, that would give them a glimmer of hope. "There is no cure for the plague," I said, my voice steady, though my heart was heavy. "But I will treat what I can. I will ease your suffering." The villagers stared at me, their faces a mixture of disbelief and desperation. Some of them had already begun to kneel, clutching their hands in prayer, begging for salvation. The weight of their superstition was palpable, suffocating the room. As the night drew on, I moved from one bed to another, performing my duties as best as I could. The villagers, once proud and defiant, had been reduced to a trembling mass of fear and illness. Their homes were filled with the sounds of coughing, of cries for help that would go unanswered, and through it all, I could feel the weight of their beliefs pressing against me, like an invisible force, making everything harder. Their faith in a cure that did not exist was as real as the sickness that was slowly claiming them. I could offer them only the truth, but it was a truth they were unwilling to accept. By morning, the village was quieter still. Some of the sick had died, their bodies already cold. Others lay in a feverish stupor, their chances of survival dwindling. With each passing hour, the ritual had done nothing. The curse was not lifted, and the plague remained. I left the village as the sun began to rise, the shadows of the trees still stretching long across the road. I had done what I could, but I knew this was just another chapter in a long and endless story. Another village lost to fear, to superstition, to the plague, and still the disease spread, silent and unstoppable, its grip tightening on all who stood in its way. The last breath of a merchant, Venice, 1630s. I had received the call late in the afternoon, a desperate plea from a family member. A wealthy merchant, they claimed, had fallen ill. At first, I thought it would be no different than the other calls I'd responded to. But when I arrived at the merchant's grand estate, the sight that awaited me told a different story altogether. The house was quiet, too quiet. The grand entrance, once filled with the laughter and clinking of wine glasses, was now abandoned. The polished marble floors were cracked in places, and the walls were covered in layers of dust. But it wasn't the silence that unsettled me. It was the smell. A pungent, acrid stench hung in the air, thick and sour, like rotting flesh. I stepped cautiously through the entrance, my boots clicking softly against the cold marble, the shadows of the evening creeping through the windows. I called out, but no one answered. I was alone. I followed the stench to a grand chamber at the back of the house. The room had once been lavishly furnished, but now the furniture was overturned, the curtains drawn tightly shut. A sense of abandonment filled the air, and a chill ran down my spine. There, in the center of the room, lay the merchant. His body was twisted, as though in the throes of agony, his limbs contorted in unnatural angles. His face, once full of pride and arrogance, was now pale and swollen, the skin stretched taut over his skull. He had been in the final stages of The plague for hours, perhaps days, but the disease had taken him quickly, ravaging his body with a brutal efficiency. I knelt beside the bed, my gloved hands hovering over him. The merchant's breathing was shallow, ragged, a wet rasp that seemed to come from the very depths of his chest. His eyes fluttered open, and for a moment there was recognition. He knew me. But it wasn't gratitude I saw in his gaze. It was desperation. "Help me," he gasped, his voice barely a whisper. His lips were cracked, dry, and I could see the blood pooling in the corners of his mouth. I shook my head, even as my heart twisted in sympathy. The plague had already claimed him. There was no cure for this, no remedy. "There's nothing I can do," I said quietly, though I knew he couldn't understand. The pustules that covered his skin, the bloated belly, the deep dark blackness of his extremities. It was clear that the disease had worked its wicked way through him. His body was already falling apart, the decay visible beneath his skin. But it was what I saw next that made my stomach lurch. The merchant's legs, once sturdy and powerful, were now covered in open sores. I could see the maggots crawling in and out of the flesh, burrowing into the rotting tissue. His hands, once manicured and strong, were nothing more than twisted claws, the nails blackened and split. The pustules on his face burst suddenly, the sickening sound of bursting flesh echoing through the room as thick, yellow pus oozed from the open sores. The stench was unbearable, the putrid liquid dribbling down his chin and onto the sheets. His skin had begun to slough off in places, and it was clear that the rot had set in. He was beyond saving. I felt my stomach turn. This was not just a plague, it was the very face of death, grotesque and unrelenting. The merchant's once proud life had been reduced to this pitiful, decaying shell. The disease had stripped him of everything, and now all that remained was a body on the edge of complete decomposition. With a sickening crack, his ribs gave way, a final, desperate breath rattling from his lungs. The sound of breaking bone filled the room, and I stepped back in horror as his body spasmed violently. Blood poured from his mouth in torrents, the deep red staining his clothing and the bed beneath him. His body lurched once more, then fell limp. The life had drained from him completely. I stood there for a moment, frozen, as the horror of what I had just witnessed sank in. The once wealthy merchant, who had likely spent his life acquiring riches and luxuries, had been reduced to nothing more than a bag of decaying flesh. He had died alone, abandoned by his family, his wealth meaningless in the face of this ruthless disease. I could hear the sound of my own breath, harsh and shallow, as the room seemed to close in around me. The stench of death hung heavy in the air, but I had no choice. I had to act. There was no time for mourning. There were others who would need me. There always were. I turned away from the merchant's body, the weight of his death pressing down on me like a heavy stone. I knew I would have to report this gruesome, grotesque scene to the authorities, but part of me hoped they would never come. I couldn't bear the thought of them seeing this. This wasn't just a death. It was the end of something much bigger. This was the future of every soul who fell victim to the plague. This was the fate of them all, but there was more to do. More people who needed help. Or at least, more people who needed to be attended to before they too succumbed to the disease. It was a vicious cycle, a never-ending march of death, and I was caught in the middle of it, unable to stop it. The merchant's family would never know the full extent of his suffering. They had abandoned him, too afraid of the disease to stay. They would hear only of his final moments, his body found cold and lifeless in the bed where he had once slept so comfortably. They would never understand what it had truly been like as I gathered my tools, the smell of death still thick in the air. I knew this was just one more chapter in a never-ending story of suffering and loss. The plague was still here, still claiming lives, and it showed no sign of stopping. And so I left, the gruesome image of the merchant's body lingering in my mind as I stepped back into the night, where more darkness awaited. The Forgotten Child, Venice, 1630s. The streets were empty, save for the sound of my boots echoing in the silence. The homes around me had grown quiet, their windows shuttered tight, their doors locked, the world inside sealed off from the plague. That raged outside. I had been called to a house in the less prosperous part of the city, the kind of place where sickness and death had already made their mark. It was strange the way the disease didn't choose between the wealthy and the poor. Rich merchants and beggars alike fell prey to it. The address was scribbled hastily on the parchment, and as I arrived, I saw the house was one of the many that had been abandoned, its windows dark, its door ajar. I pushed it open cautiously, the door creaking as it swung inward, the smell of rot and decay immediately hitting my nose. But it wasn't the smell that caused my breath to catch in my throat. It was the silence, her deep, suffocating silence that seemed unnatural in the face of death. I called out, my voice breaking the stillness, "Is anyone here?" The silence stretched on. There was no answer, but something was off. The air inside the house felt thick, stale, and oppressive, as though it had been trapped inside for far too long. I moved cautiously through the entryway, my eyes scanning the dim light. The house looked untouched, but there, lying in the middle of the living room, was a small child. He was sitting on the floor, his legs pulled to his chest, his eyes staring vacantly at the far wall. A small brown smear stained the corner of his lip. His clothes were dirtied and his face was pale, too pale for someone so young. The child didn't acknowledge me. His eyes didn't even blink. He simply sat there, lost in some private world, his small body stiff and unmoving. I approached slowly, my gloved hand reaching out to touch the child's shoulder. The reaction was immediate. The boy flinched, his body jerking as if startled from a nightmare. His eyes focused on me, then dropped to the ground. Are you hungry?" I asked softly, though I knew the answer. He nodded slowly, the faintest hint of understanding in his eyes. But then he turned away, as if the question didn't matter. I knew what was wrong. I had seen this before. But even now I was not prepared for the devastation that lay within the house. I took a deep breath and walked further into the room. It was only then that I saw them, the bodies. A man face down on the floor, his body swollen and bloated, a dark purple hue staining his skin where the plague had taken hold. Beside him, the body of a woman, curled up in the corner, her hands still clutching at the air as if trying to reach someone even in death. She had died hours ago, maybe days. Her skin was the color of ash, and her lips were cracked open, as though she had been gasping for air in her final moments. I felt my stomach churn at the sight. The child had been alone in this room, abandoned to witness the death of his parents, and now he was left to deal with the aftermath. This was the real horror of the plague. The children who had no one to turn to, no one to care for them. The parents, likely not aware of the severity of the plague when it began, had succumbed to its ravages quickly. But it wasn't just the disease that had killed them. It was the reality of living with it, of being so close to death, of losing everything you knew and loved without even the time to prepare. I knelt beside the boy again, my hand resting on his shoulder. "Where is your family?" I asked gently. He blinked, his gaze distant. He didn't respond, but it wasn't necessary. I already knew they were gone, abandoned in their final moments, left behind to rot in the silent house, as the plague continued its unrelenting march across the city. I couldn't help the pang of sadness that filled my chest. I had seen this too many times. The families torn apart, the loved ones lost, the children left behind. But this was a reminder of just how cruel the plague could be. The child was not just suffering from hunger, from lack of care. He was suffering from the weight of his grief, of being forced to bear witness to his parents' deaths without anyone to tell him what had happened. As I moved to examine the bodies, something caught my eye. A letter. It had been hastily placed. Beside the man's body, a handwritten note stained with blood and tears. The words were blurred, but I could make out the final sentence. "We are lost, please forgive us." The plague had claimed them, and now it was claiming this poor child as well. His life, his innocence, would be taken by the very disease that had ravaged his parents. I could see the fear in his eyes, the confusion. He didn't understand what was happening. He only knew that his parents were gone, and that he was now utterly alone. I looked at the child one more time, and in that moment, I could see everything the disease had stolen. Not just lives, not just bodies, but hope, security, and the comfort of a family. I stood, my gaze fixed on the child, and I whispered a prayer. There was nothing I could do for him. He had already been lost in this plague-ridden world. I had to move on. But I would never forget the child's face, the vacant stare, the sorrowful silence. It would haunt me for the rest of my days. The Alchemist's Folly, Prague, 1631. The city was a graveyard wrapped in fog. The plague had gnawed at its edges for months, but here, in the shadow of the castle, the wealthy still clung to their illusions of safety. The letter had arrived with its wax seal pressed with the mark of a noble house, a raven clutching a dagger. Baron von Adler demanded my presence, not for the sick, not for the dying, but for himself. The gates of his estate groaned as I pushed them open. No guards, no servants, just the distant rhythmic tap-tap-tap of something dripping onto stone. The path to the manor was lined with torches, their flames shuddering in the damp air. The door was unlocked. Inside, the smell hit me first. Incense, blood and something sweetly rotten like fruit left too long in the sun. The grand hall was dark, the chandeliers unlit, the only light coming from a single candelabra at the far end. A figure stood beside it, cloaked in shadow. Baron? My voice echoed too loudly in the emptiness. The figure turned. His face was gaunt, his eyes two pits of feverish intensity. He held a goblet in one hand, the liquid inside black as tar. "Ah," he murmured. "The plague doctor arrives. Tell me, do you believe in miracles?" I didn't answer. The question was a trap. He stepped forward, the candlelight carving deep hollows beneath his cheekbones. "They say you carry the secrets of the dying, that you hear their last words, their confessions. Is it true?" "I carry nothing but medicine," I said, "and the stench of the dead." He laughed, a sound like dry leaves scraping stone. "Medicine, yes. That's why I called you. Not for the sick, for the cure." He led me deeper into the manor, down a winding staircase, into a cellar that reeked of copper and burnt herbs. The walls were lined with shelves of glass jars, each filled with murky liquid, and things I didn't want to recognize. At the center of the room stood a wooden table, stained dark. Strapped to it was a man. No, not a man anymore. A corpse. His chest had been split open, the ribs pried apart like a grotesque offering. The Baron set his goblet down beside a row of vials, each labeled in a shaky hand. "Plague blood, mercury, nightshade. They say the cure lies in the disease itself," he said, running a finger along the corpse's exposed heart. "That if we drink the poison, we become immune." I stared at him. "That's madness. Is it?" He lifted the goblet to his lips and drank deeply. When he lowered it, his mouth was smeared black. I felt the fever for days, and yet I live. A noise from the corner. A whimper. I turned. A girl, no older than 16, huddled in a cage. Her wrists were raw from shackles. Her eyes, wide with terror. The Baron followed my gaze. "Ah, my insurance, the pure, the untouched. If my theory is correct, her blood will be the final ingredient." I lunged for the cage, but he was faster. A knife flashed in his hand, pressed to the girl's throat. "Don't," he warned. "You'll spoil the experiment." The girl's breath came in shallow gasps. "Please," she whispered. I could have killed him then, should have. But the Baron was already sick, already dying. His hands shook, sweat glistened on his brow. His cure was nothing but poison, and he knew it. He coughed, a wet, rattling sound. Black spattered the front of his doublet. "It's working," he gasped. Then he collapsed. The girl screamed as his body convulsed, as his veins turned black beneath his skin. I unlocked the cage, pulled her free. She was trembling, her fingers clutching my sleeve like a drowning man clutches driftwood. "Is he dead?" I didn't check his pulse. I didn't need to. The cellar was silent now, save for the drip of the Baron's ruined goblet pooling on the floor. The girl stared at the corpse, at the open chest, at the vials of stolen blood. "Why?" she asked. I had no answer. Outside, the first light of dawn touched the rooftops of Prague. The plague would take the Baron's body soon enough. But his madness, that would linger. I led the girl into the streets, the weight of the dead heavy, on my back. Some cures are worse than the disease, some men are worse than the plague. The Rat King, Vienna, 1679. The first thing they found was the boy, or what was left of him. He lay curled in the straw of his family's barn, his nightshirt stiff with dried blood, his face frozen in a scream no one had heard. His mother swore she'd put him to bed healthy, swore she'd kissed his forehead and bolted the door against the night air, but when dawn came, his crib was empty. They found him an hour later, his tiny body nestled between the hay bales like a broken doll. The physician called it plague. The priest called it God's wrath. I called it a lie, because the boy's wounds weren't from God or disease. His fingers were gnawed to the bone. The farmer's wife clutched her shawl tighter as she led me to the barn. "We heard nothing," she whispered. "Not a cry, not a struggle, just the scratching." The barn door groaned as I pushed it open. The stench hit me first. Blood and ammonia, the thick musk of terrified animals. The livestock had been moved, but their panic lingered in the kicked-up straw, the splintered wood where they'd strained against their ropes, and in the center of it all, the boy's tiny body. I knelt beside him. The bite marks were unmistakable, small, sharp, clustered at the joints where the skin was thinnest. His wrists, his neck, the soft flesh behind his knees. But it was his face that told the true horror. His lips were gone entirely, his teeth exposed in a permanent ghoulish grin. "Rats," the farmer's wife breathed. "Must have been, but we've never had trouble with vermin before." A rustle in the hay made her jump. I turned slowly. A shadow darted between the stalls, too large for a rat, too low to the ground for a cat. Then the screaming started in the village. They called it the Totenfresser, the Death Eater, a creature of folklore said to follow plagues like a shadow, growing fat on the dying. The church dismissed it as peasant superstition. The physicians blamed wild dogs, but I'd seen the nests, beneath the floorboards of abandoned houses, in the thatch of plague-stricken homes, tangled masses of fur and bone and teeth, where dozens, hundreds of rats had twisted together, their tails knotted like some grotesque living rope. The farmers whispered that if you listened at night, you could hear them chittering. Not the mindless squeaks of vermin, but something darker, something that chose its prey. The next victim was a gravedigger. They found him half buried in his own trench, his eyes and tongue missing, his pockets full of teeth that weren't his. The night after, a milkmaid vanished from her bed, leaving only a blood stain shaped like a nest in the straw. The rats grew bolder. They stopped hiding. I saw one watching me from an alley as I returned from the dead house. It sat unnaturally still, its greasy fur matted with something dark. Its eyes gleamed red in the lantern light. Not the dull shine of an animal's gaze, but intelligent, calculating. When I took a step forward, it didn't flee. It smiled. The apothecary's shop was the last straw. They found him at dawn, his jars of remedies shattered, his shelves stripped. Bare. His body was curled in the corner, his arms clutched to his chest like he'd died hugging himself. At first glance, it seemed the plague had taken him. His skin was waxy, his lips blue. Then they turned him over. His stomach was a hollow cavern, picked clean to the ribs, and nestled inside, warm and pulsing, was a nest of newborn rats, their blind faces smeared with his blood. That night the city burned. They torched the granaries first, then the slums, then the very streets themselves. The rats fled in shrieking waves, their tangled bodies writhing like a single living thing as the flames took them. For weeks after, the river ran black with their corpses. But plague rats don't drown, and dead things don't always stay buried. Last night I woke to the sound of scratching at my door. Not the timid scrape of a lone rodent, but something heavier, something purposeful. When I looked out, the street was empty, but my doorstep was littered with teeth, small, sharp, human. The Butcher of London. The River Thames was choked with bodies. They floated face down in the brackish water, their bloated limbs tangled in the reeds like discarded dolls. Some still wore their Sunday best, fine lace collars now stiff with grime, velvet doublets split at the seams from swelling flesh. Others were naked, stripped by thieves or the current itself. All of them bore the marks, the blackened skin, the weeping sores. God's cruel fingerprints. I wasn't here for them. The note had been slipped under my door before first light, the handwriting jagged, desperate. They're burying them alive at the Crossbones yard. Come before sundown. Tell no one. The graveyard, squatted at the edge of Southwark, a place where the poor and the nameless were dumped into pits too shallow to hold them. The stench hit me first, rot and quicklime, the reek of mass graves, but beneath it, something worse, something fresh. The gate hung broken on its hinges. Inside, the earth was disturbed in long, ragged trenches, and beside the newest pit, a figure hunched over a half-filled grave, his back to me. You! My voice cut through the fog. The man spun, shovel in hand. His face was wrapped in stained linen, but his eyes, Christ, his eyes were wide, wild, not with fear, with hunger. At his feet the grave pulsed, a hand thrust up from the dirt, fingers clawing at the air. A muffled scream bubbled from below. The man didn't flinch. He brought the shovel down. Crack. The screaming stopped. I lunged, grabbing his arm. As he raised the shovel again, up close his breath reeked of rotten meat. They're still alive when they bring them, he hissed. The fever makes them sleep like the dead. I'm doing mercy. I shoved him back. The pit gurgled. Another hand emerged, this one small. A child's. The butcher smiled. 2 shillings a body, he said. The city pays me to make 'em stay buried. Behind us, the gates creaked. A cart rolled in, piled high with fresh corpses. A boy no older than 12 sat atop it, his face grey with exhaustion. Where do you want this lot, master? The butcher wiped his brow, leaving a streak of grave dirt. Start digging. I should have killed him. But the plague doesn't care about justice, only appetite. That night I dreamt of hands breaking through soil, of small voices calling from the dark. When I returned at dawn, the pits were quiet. The Silent Bell, Florence, 1348. The bell tower had been silent for 13 days when they called for me. Not the slow, mournful tolling that marked another plague death. This was a different kind of silence, the kind that prickled the back of your neck when you passed beneath the shadow of Santa Maria del Fiore, the kind that made even the bravest street urchins cross themselves and scurry away. The priest who met me at the base of the tower couldn't meet my eyes. His hands, usually so steady when swinging the censer, shook like an old woman's as he pressed the rusted key into my palm. It started with the bell ringer, he whispered. Then the choir boys. Now it answers. The staircase spiraled upward, into darkness, each worn stone step slick with something that wasn't water. My lantern's flame guttered as I climbed, casting monstrous shadows that seemed to lean in as I passed. The smell grew worse with every turn, not the familiar reek of plague rot, but something older, something that had been waiting in the stones, long before the first corpse piled up in the streets. At the belfry's threshold, I found the first choir boy, little Tommaso, they'd called him, the one with the voice like angels must have before they fell. He knelt before the great bronze bell, his hands clasped as if in prayer. His lips moved soundlessly, forming words that made my eyes water to even glimpse. The skin of his fingers had worn away to bone from where he'd been, scratching. Not at the bell, at the space beneath it. The other boys lay in a circle around the bell's base, their mouths stretched wide in silent screams, their throats ripped open not by knives or teeth, but as if something had reached up from inside and torn its way out. Their blood formed strange patterns on the stones, symbols that twisted when you tried to look at them directly. And the bell. Oh God, the bell. It hung perfectly still, yet the air around it shimmered like heat on summer cobbles. The bronze bore, no reflection. Where my face should have been, only a yawning darkness stared back. And when I reached out, why did I reach out? My glove came away sticky with something blacker than pitch that squirmed between my fingers. That's when Tommaso's head snapped up. His eyes were gone. In their place, twin pools of that same impossible darkness stared through me. His mouth kept moving, those awful silent words pouring forth, and with them came the sound I'd been dreading. A single resonant toll from the unmoving bell. From beneath the bell. The stones trembled. The dead choir boys twitched. And in the streets below, a new kind of screaming began. I ran. We all ran. But last night, as the plague carts rolled through empty streets, everyone heard it. That deep, sonorous tone no living hand could have struck. And this morning, they found the first of the new dead, their ears stuffed with blackened wax, their mouths sewn shut with their own hair, and their hands, oh Christ, their hands, raw to the bone from trying to dig their way back into the earth before whatever the bell woke could find them again. The drowning quarter, Amsterdam, 1624. The canals had begun speaking in tongues. It started with the fishermen, rough men who laughed at ghost stories and crossed themselves only in church, coming pale from their boats at dawn, their nets cut loose, their catches dumped back into the black water. They spoke of voices rising with the evening tide, not from the streets or taverns, but from beneath the ice-crusted surface. Not Dutch, not any language of men. The watermen refused to ply their trade near the old Jewish quarter where the plague had hit hardest, where entire families had been boarded into their homes and left to die. The barges piled high with corpses still floated there, frozen in place like some grotesque flotilla, their cargoes of the dead left to bloat and burst beneath the winter sun. The city magistrates had declared the area quarantined, then forgotten. But something in those corpse-choked canals remembered. I went at twilight, when the last light turned the ice to mercury and the shadows between the barges grew teeth. The stench should have been unbearable, 200 plague dead left to rot in standing water, but as my boots crunched over the frozen cobbles of the abandoned quarter, the air carried only a wet, mineral chill, like the breath of a deep cave. The first bridge groaned beneath my weight, its timbers slick with unnatural frost. Below, the barges formed a solid mass, their plague dead frozen in poses of final agony, their outstretched hands pressed against the wood like they'd tried to claw their way out even after death. And between them the water moved, not the lazy swirl of current but something purposeful, a slow, sinuous rippling that formed shapes just beneath the surface, fingers, faces, mouths opening and closing as if chanting. The ice didn't crack. It bent, bowing upward in perfect, unbroken curves that mirrored the movement below. I crouched, my plague mask's beak nearly touching the frozen rail, and saw my reflection warp in the ice, my face stretched long, my eyes gone black and depthless. Then the water beneath the ice stilled, and something stared back, not my reflection, something wearing my face like a poorly fitted mask. I recoiled so violently the bridge shook. The frozen dead on the nearest barge shuddered with the impact, and one, a child, her face half-eaten by frost, slid forward with a sound like tearing parchment, her hollow eyes fixed on me, her blue lips parted, and from the ruin of her throat came a wet, bubbling whisper. They're waking. The ice exploded. Geyser of black water erupted between the barges, showering me in freezing filth. Something long and pale lashed beneath the surface. Not an arm, not a fish, but some terrible amalgam of both, its skin webbed with veins like river deltas. The nearest corpses jerked as if hooked, their frozen limbs snapping like kindling as they were dragged beneath. The barges themselves began to tilt, their plague-dead cargo spilling into the suddenly churning water. And beneath it all, rising through the chaos like some monstrous choir, came the voices, hundreds of them, thousands, whispering, laughing, singing in that impossible language that turned my bones to water. I ran. Behind me the canals were coming, alive, their waterspouts twisting into shapes that defied the very idea of anatomy. The houses lining the quarter trembled, as if something vast moved beneath their foundations. And as I reached the quarantine barrier, that flimsy wall of nailed planks, I heard the first wet, slithering impact of something heavy dragging itself onto the ice behind me. They found me at dawn, half frozen in a gutter 3 districts over, my boots filled with black water that refused to freeze no matter how cold the night grew. The magistrates dismissed my ravings. The fishermen burned their boats. And now, when the moon is high, the guards at the city's bridges report seeing shapes moving beneath the ice. Not the slow drift of current, but things that swim against it, heading inland. Heading upward, last night the first of the drowned barges washed up in the merchant's quarter. Empty, not a single corpse remained. But the wood was covered in teeth marks. And the canals have started freezing red. And so, my fellow travelers, we close this chapter of horrors. But the Plague Doctor's ledger is never truly full. If these tales have slithered under your skin, let me know in the shadows below. Which story haunted you the most? Don't forget to leave a like, subscribe, and ring that bell. Thank you for listening.